there. Today we're going to be learning about common factoring. Before we get into what common factoring is, let's go over this example. In grade 9, you learned the distributive law, which was to take the term that is on the outside of the bracket and to multiply it by each term on the inside of the bracket. And what does that give you? What is negative 2x times 3x? That is negative 6x squared. What is negative 2x times negative 2? That is negative 4x. So going from this being the question to this being the answer is using the distributive law. And that instruction would be to simplify. Now, going from this being the question to this being the answer, that is what is common factoring. So, the process of reversing the distributive law is called common factoring. It's just switching around which one is the question and which one is the answer. So let's go over the steps on how to do this. So what we're going to do is we're going to common factor 12x to the 5 plus 18x to the 3. The first thing you do is determine the greatest common factor of these two terms. Now that we typically just call the GCF. Now the greatest common factor is made up of two parts. The first part is the biggest number that will divide into 12 and 18. So what is the biggest number that divides into 12 and 18? And that number is 6. So a number that divides into another number is called a factor. So the largest common factor of 12 and 18 is 6. So the first thing to do is look for the biggest number that will divide into both coefficients. The second thing you're looking for is the lowest exponent of the common variables. So both terms have a common variable of x. This term has 5 x's. This term has 3 x's. That means the most number of x's that you can take to the outside of the bracket is 3. You can't take out any more than 3 x's from each term because this term doesn't have more than 3 x's. So those are the two parts to the greatest common factor. So it's the biggest number that divides into the coefficients, so the biggest number that divides into 12 and 18, and any common variables, which means they both have an x. You take out an x with the smallest exponent, which is 3. So first step is to determine the greatest common factor. The second step is to divide the polynomial by the greatest common factor, which means each of these terms gets divided by 6x cubed. So when you divide each of these by 6x cubed, 12 divided by 6 is 2. X to the 5 divided by x to the 3. Remember, when you divide powers, you subtract the exponents, so that would be x squared. When you divide positive 18 divided by 6, you get positive 3. And x to the 3 divided by x to the 3, subtract the exponents. 3 minus 3 is 0, so you don't have to write it. So that is the quotient of dividing your expression by your greatest common factor. The third step is to write as a product with the greatest common factor on the outside of the bracket and the quotient on the inside of the bracket. So basically, with this quotient, what you're going to do is put the 6x cubed in the front, and that's your final answer. If you were to check, you just use the distributive law. 6x cubed times 2x squared is 18x to the 5. 6x cubed times 3, that is 12x to the 5. 6x to the 3 times 3 is 18x to the 3, which is what we started with. So this right here is your final answer. And that's how you common factor. So once again, the difference between factoring and simplifying. Simplifying is using the rules of algebra to remove the brackets and collect like terms. So that would be distributive law from grade 9, foiling, which we did last day of multiplying the two binomials. Factoring is using the rules of algebra to write your expression as a product of two or more factors which are separated by brackets. So this here, this is a factor, this is a factor. We're separating the two factors by multiplication because this is times in between. And then you just separate the two factors using brackets. So let's go over a couple of examples. For here, to simplify, take the term on the outside, multiply it with each term on the inside. 3x times 2x equals 6x squared. 3x times negative 5 is negative 15x. Factoring is undoing this process. So, first of all, find the greatest common factor. The biggest number that can divide into 6 and 15 is 3. They both have an x, and the smallest exponent, since this exponent is 1, the smallest exponent would be 1. So your greatest common factor is 3x. Second step is to divide each by 3x. 6x squared divided by 3x gives you 2x. Negative 15x divided by negative 3x gives you negative 5. And your greatest common factor goes on the outside. So you can see here what we ended up with your question and what you originally started with is now your answer. So we'll do one more example together and then you will try. So here, what is the biggest number that will divide into 16, 24, and 8? That biggest number is 8. The only thing you have to keep in mind is if the coefficient of the first term is negative, then the negative should be factored out with the greatest common factor. So if your expression starts with a negative, the negative is taken out with the greatest common factor. Now, since they all have an x, the x is part of the greatest common factor, and the lowest exponent is 2. If you have a question like this, where they don't all have an x, that means the x is not part of the greatest common factor, and your greatest common factor will only be a number. So when you divide each of these by negative 8x to the 2, you are left with, when you divide these, you've got 2x squared. When you divide these, you have 3x. And when you divide these, you have -1. And don't forget to put the greatest common factor on the outside. Okay, so pause the video, and then what I want you to do is to try these two questions on your own, and then you can play the video again and check your answers. Okay, here's the answers that you should have gotten. Question 1 was very similar to what we've done before. The only difference with question 2 is that there was no x in the final term, which meant there was no x in the greatest common factor. And because the leading coefficient here is negative, you take the negative out with the greatest common factor. So if there were either of those that you didn't understand, make sure you make note of it and ask your teacher the next day. Okay, we're about to run out of time on this video, so what I want you to do is in order to finish this lesson, you're going to have to watch part 2 of this lesson. Please don't forget to play part 2 of the lesson. So this video is going to stop now and continue with part 2 of the lesson.